Hello. In honor of John Locke and C.S. Lewis, I'd like to offer these excerpts from my new book, The Reason of Reason, which can be found in Amazon.com. In it, I argue that the best explanation for reason and a rational order is God. C.S. Lewis, 1898 to 1963, was professor of medieval literature at Oxford and Cambridge. Having come out of atheism, he became one of the most prolific Christian philosophers of the 20th century. Lewis formulated an argument for God based on the fact of reason, which contributes to my book's argument. In his essay, Is Theology Poetry?, Lewis wrote, "Long before I believed theology to be true, I had already decided that the popular scientific picture, that is, naturalism, was false. One absolutely central inconsistency ruins it. The whole picture professes to depend on inferences from observed facts. Unless inference is valid, the whole picture disappears. Unless we can be sure that reality in the remotest nebula or the remotest part obeys the thought laws of the human scientist here and now in his laboratory, in other words, unless reason is an absolute, all is in ruins. Yet those who ask me to believe this world picture also ask me to believe that reason is simply the unforeseen and unintended byproduct of mindless matter at one stage of its endless and aimless becoming. Here is flat contradiction. They ask me at the same moment to accept a conclusion and to discredit the only testimony on which that conclusion can be based. The difficulty is, to me, a fatal one, and the fact that when you put it to many scientists, far from having an answer, they seem not even to understand what the difficulty is. That assures me that I have not found a mare's nest, but detected a radical disease in their whole mode of thought from the very beginning. Interesting. Lewis was a man of faith who thought reason was absolute. In this quote, he seems to point to the fact that it is by reason that we comprehend the world and the reality in which we find ourselves. But he also seems to think it is unreasonable to ascribe reason to mindless matter. In other words, in reasoning about reasoning itself, Lewis was so impressed with its powers that it seemed utterly unreasonable to him that reason could be the product of something without it. This is an idea that has captured my thoughts as well and has been a stimulus for this book. Lewis surmised that the most reasonable source of reason should be a rational one, as do I. Again, Lewis was a man of faith, but he is not talking about faith here, only reason. So his argument is that the fact of reason itself, the very presupposition of it, points strongly to a divine source. I agree. I think Lewis is asserting that the exercise of reason involves a kind of implicit faith in reason that is necessary to follow it where it leads, but also that reason actually bolsters the exercise of faith, at least it should. This is an important part of my perspective on reason, too. In the following quote, Lewis emphasized the validity of reasoning. All possible knowledge, then, depends on the validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty, which we express by words like must be and therefore and since, is a real perception of how things outside our minds really must be, well and good. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds and not a genuine insight into realities beyond them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we can have no knowledge. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. It follows that no account of the universe can be true, unless that account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court. For that theory would itself have been reached by thinking, and if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound. a proof that there are no such things as proofs, which is nonsense. I think Lewis's first sentence captures the main idea quite succinctly. When I say I think, I mean I reason so, of course. As a rational exercise, allow me to analyze my own thinking a little to subject my own reason to reason. This is called metacognition. By my own modest powers of reason, I have buttressed my argument by appealing to the reasoning of another thinker whose intellect was far superior to my own. There's much agreement that Lewis was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. The simple tool of reason I'm employing now is the appeal to authority, which I wish to defend just a little. This practice seems to have a dubious reputation. In the ethics course I took at the University of Michigan, one year the professor emphasized that the practice of appealing to authority is not a valid means of arriving at ethical truth, or any kind of truth for that matter. But to substantiate his assertion, he did that very thing. All scholarly works are expected to do so, which is quite reasonable. The basic principle is, though perhaps not a law of logic, that all thinkers are weighted, formally or informally, and different thinkers command different levels of respect and credibility. Ergo, some thinkers are weighted more heavily than others and deserve more attention, such as C.S. Lewis. By appealing to his words, which agree so robustly with my argument, it is reasonable for me to expect them to reinforce and even strengthen it, assuming that you acknowledge both his credibility and his thoughts. We all do this, both in speaking and in writing, because the logic behind it is valid. Almost every passable paper one writes in university, after all, is expected to cite credible authorities on the subject. So, appeal to authority is actually respected and expected. That's one reason why I am confident that both Lewis and Chesterton, to whom I referred earlier, have strengthened my case by their words. And there are still more thinkers whose words will contribute to our discussion by strength of reputation or by erudition alone. The strength of one's ideas should be authoritative in its own right. This, too, is reasonable. The point of all this is that without faith in reason, there could be no philosophy, sociology, or science of any kind. No understanding, no meaning, no language, no communication, no civilization, no technology, no law, no knowing anything at all. Not even the belief of knowing something. But thankfully, that is not the way things are. Omne ens est scissible. All being is knowable, and this is necessarily so for the sentient existence we enjoy. All things are not random and unstable. They are patterned and predictable to us. These are the fundamental building blocks of all cognition and rational life that have been provided by a rational God, the God of the Bible. I'm Scott Cherry, author of The Reason of Reason.